So Hui Peng provided a wonderful segue into this panel's topics. It's very interesting what's going on with the pandemic, what may happen with highly automated vehicles as well as electric vehicles. I was reading about a survey in the UK that was conducted less than a week ago. And people are extremely interested in purchasing electric vehicles because they very much enjoy lack of smog in many urban settings where congestion has caused a terrible carbon footprint. So we live in crazy but very interesting times. And we're fortunate to have a panel that can address these really interesting issues. So we're going to start with my friend and colleague, Peter Appel. Peter is Director of Transportation and Supply Chain at AlixPartners. AlixPartners is one of the world's premier consulting and business intelligence firms. Each of the panelists, I've asked them to go over their background briefly. I know the bios are available to everyone, but it would be nice to have them just spend a few minutes talking about themselves. They each have a presentation. And then we're going to have questions at the end. If this works as planned, we'll have at least 15 minutes worth of time for questions from the participants. Just one other word about myself. In addition to my day job as a consultant in the ITS world, I chair the Michigan Council on Future Mobility, which at the end of this month will become, or will be changed to the Michigan Council on Mobility and Electrification. So it's an interesting change and a great opportunity for a new council on future mobility. With that, I'd like to turn it over to Peter.
John, thank you. Thank you very much. It's really great to be here. I really enjoyed seeing some of the earlier presentations on this very timely topic. A little bit about myself and AlixPartners very briefly. AlixPartners is a general management consulting firm with our roots in the turnaround business, and we were heavily involved in the turnaround of General Motors 12 years ago, but really work across every industry around the globe with roots in the Detroit area. So automotive is a big part of what we do. We work with OEMs, with tier ones, with retailers, just on a range of issues associated with operations improvement strategy and the like. And so the changes in the fundamental structure of the automotive industry are important to us. And so in addition to working with clients on their day-to-day issues, we tend to like to research where the industry is going, hence the kind of market research that I'll talk a little bit about here. I joined AlixPartners about 8 years ago after leaving my second stint at the U.S. Department of Transportation. I most recently led the Research and Innovative Technology Administration. Earlier in my career, I was at the FAA. And really, transportation is kind of the common thread of my career, whether in operating companies or public sector or consulting. So I enjoy this topic in particular because it really represents the nexus of those things. I'll talk a little bit about just overall perception of autonomous vehicles based on our research around the world, looking not only at the technologies, but ownership models and particular concerns and potential barriers to broader customer acceptance, and some of our thoughts about how we can address some of those barriers. So just overall big picture, awareness is a mixed bag. Huge awareness of certain aspects of autonomous, very little awareness of others. Consumers see value in autonomous and automated vehicles, but not necessarily enough value to justify the costs that are out there today. So there's a gap that needs to be overcome. And we'll talk a little bit more about the value premium associated with consumers. And some of the business issues and the barriers. AV safety. I'm a student of transportation safety throughout my entire career. I see tremendous value, safety value from autonomous, but the perception of safety and the results in safety really have a big gap. Again, an area of opportunity for this industry. Consumers are not gung-ho to adopt. People want this technology, but they're patient and they're willing to wait. And they're concerned. They want their concerns about safety to be addressed. They want their concerns about cyber attacks, and just a regulatory framework that gives more confidence. So those are some of the things I'll talk about in the next few minutes. In context, this page, what we call the CASE, Connected Autonomous Shared and Electrified Ecosystem across the automotive industry, is something that we have worked with clients really in each of these 4 sectors across. And what we see in this age of the automotive industry, unlike any previous generation in automotive, the collective partnerships across sometimes very, very different industry structures between the high-tech industries in the lower right-hand corner and the traditional OEMs and some of the players in between. These relationships are very new, but they're critical to making what we're talking about here succeed. So I'll start with a big picture of recent surveying we did in 2019 about awareness of autonomous self-driving vehicles. Very, very high awareness around the world, particularly in China, but really across, we saw universally well above 90% awareness of autonomous vehicles around the world. So that's a good starting point, a good foundation for building greater consumer awareness. But when you start peeling the onion a bit and surveying the difference in awareness of what we refer to as level 2 versus level 4, there's much, much less awareness of the true nature of level 4 autonomy than some of the driver assist that's much more out there in the marketplace. And there are certainly big gaps in certain parts of the world, in Europe, in that awareness. Again, China appears to have the highest awareness of level 4 autonomy, but some of the European countries, so in particular Germany, for example, less so. But at the same time, what you see on this page is a very, very big gap in the awareness of any given country between their awareness of the kinds of things we see as level 2 and the kinds of things we see as level 4. And there's a takeaway here, which is that autonomous doesn't mean the same thing to different audiences in the broad consumer space, and that's an important consideration as companies seek to not only market it but sort of build greater acceptance of where it is heading. Why are people interested in autonomous? Convenience, just making life easier, the daily commute easier, most important. Potential savings associated with things like car sharing and the like, important. Productivity, next. And then just the experience of the technology is not a particularly high draw relative to some of these other factors. So people are very pragmatic about their interest in autonomy. What is it going to do to make their lives, their day-to-day lives, better? And we've seen that generally consistently around the world. So with that as a backdrop, what are some of the implications about different ownership models, for example? And in particular, what's it worth to folks? And this slide really illustrates, I think, one of the most fascinating to me takeaways of our research, which is that when given descriptions and a good understanding of what level 4 is and what level 2 is, and then trying to get an assessment of what premium customers are willing to pay to get from a level 2 situation to a level 4. What you can clearly see on this page is, yeah, they're willing to pay more, but they're not willing to pay anywhere near enough additional to cover the actual cost. So there's a gap. There's going to be a case that's going to need to be made for level 4 autonomy, certainly at the current price premium, to get overall acceptance. and that, how the industry grapples with that in terms of pricing, in terms of cost structures over time, is going to be critical to what the rate of the adoption curve will look like. In terms of non-ownership models, we talked about the consumers as being pragmatic. Well, a lot of people in this industry talk about one of the pragmatic benefits of autonomous is robotaxis and ride hailing with the robotaxis, and that which begs the question of are people willing to move from the current paradigm of vehicle ownership to something like a robotaxi environment? And here we see very significant differences around the world. China, again, as way out in front in terms of people willing to take a step back and give up car ownership for a different ownership model. Obviously, different countries have situations that make it easier or harder to own and store a vehicle, and that difference certainly manifests itself in what we're seeing here. But the interest in using autonomous capabilities to adopt more of car sharing or robotaxi types environment is another key driver of acceptance, and looking at differences in perspectives on this around the world is pretty eye-opening. And another thing, again, probably not a surprise to a lot of people that are such as myself, that are students of different attitudes about cars across the generations. Younger generations are much more willing to let go of vehicle ownership for a robotaxi model, which means that as time goes by, there is more and more opportunity as these generations come of age. Again, China much more so than in the US and some of the European countries. Again, here's another one where the hypothesis, a logical hypothesis, really seems to be borne out. Lower GDP per capita appears to be very much correlated with willingness to try the robotaxi approach instead of vehicle ownership. Often vehicle ownership, is a barrier in low GDP countries to fully participating in an economy. And so the use of autonomous for robotaxis really does have the opportunity to give more folks in society, the ability to participate. And again, it's borne out in the numbers in terms of GDP. So then I'll talk a little bit about what some of the barriers are to further acceptance, and starting really with safety. And again, one of the most eye-opening areas for me is the current limited amount of confidence people have in autonomous safety around the world, relative to what I know are, in the data over the last nine or so years I've been closely following this industry, that says the confidence level should be a lot higher than it is. So there's a gap between perception and reality in terms of safety statistics associated with autonomous. When I think about the numbers of mentions today of a couple individual fatal crashes in the US over the last small number of years, and how many times one particular crash was mentioned and what lessons learned from that crash and one or another was mentioned, it underscores that in this nascent industry, any fatal accident is going to get dramatically more media attention than the thousands of fatal accidents that occur, in the non-autonomous fleet. And part of that media imbalance contributes to, again, this gap in confidence in safety compared to the actual level of safety we're observing out there. So that is something the industry needs to look at and say, how do we overcome this perception gap? So this really contributes to people not being in a rush. People, in the U.S., 79% say they'll wait 5 or more years to purchase autonomous. Again, China at the other end of the spectrum being much more likely to purchase in the 2 to 5 year time frame. But very likely we're going to have the technology out there and potentially the regulatory and insurance and societal environment that's most conducive to that technology sooner than we're going to have the full customer willingness to adopt it. There's really a lot of wait and see attitude out there, and the message that manufacturers and OEMs and really all participants in the AV space send to consumers is going to have a lot of impact about how long this wait and see attitude continues. Wait and see is partly because of uncertainty. Uncertainty probably no more a factor than in the area of cybersecurity. It's gotten a lot of attention in the media, and it's certainly a concern of a lot of people. People see cybersecurity issues in the banking industry. They see cybersecurity issues in medical, in retail, and yet when they think about cybersecurity issues and something that's controlling their vehicle, the awareness goes sky high, and there's big concerns out there, and those concerns will have to be addressed. And the industry is going to have to send very, very clear messages about what precautions are being taken to address potential cybersecurity issues. And there's a lot of grist for the media coverage that's going to cause people's concern about this technology. And again, the more effectively that manufacturers address these issues and make clear how they've addressed these issues is going to have a big impact on whether people are waiting 5 years or they're waiting 2 years, or whether they're waiting 10 years for the dust to settle and all the bugs get worked out, or the perceived bugs get worked out of the system. So where does that take us? And I want to just take us to our last page where we say, okay, well, here's what we learned, what do we do about it? And so what we've learned is they're just tremendous advances from a technology perspective, how quickly Level 2 has gotten out there, how many manufacturers, how many industry partners are playing a role in getting Level 2 autonomous out there in widespread use, multiple delivery models to ensure that this technology is available to broader swaths of the consumer base, and other players such as insurance and the legal industry really, helping build the fundamental framework associated with safety and usage in this industry. But that will only take us so far. And so on the right side of the page, it's kind of our takeaway of what needs to happen to make sure that there is a healthy step forward to really leverage this technology for the benefits to society. And my pet interest is always safety. And so I'll just throw in my editorial comment. The quicker we get to adoption, the quicker the 37,000 fatalities, on U.S. highways a year drops significantly. And so the question is, what can we do, not from a technology perspective, because there are plenty of industry players working on the technology, but rather from some of the other perspectives, safety regulatory perspective, making sure there's a clear safety regulatory framework that's fully understood by both the manufacturers, the industry partners, and the users. A clear and trusted cybersecurity regulatory and testing environment. The full participation, cooperation of state and local governments. Obviously, if the whole world were like Ann Arbor and Michigan as a whole, we'd be much, much further down the road on this, but there just needs to be a lot more input and a lot more involvement out there at the state and local level. Software certification, the art, the industry, the technology, the science of software certification has developed massive maturity in the last 30 or 40 years, particularly the last 10 or 15, to the extent that what the rest of the software industry has learned about certification of reliability is applied in this industry is going to be critical. Insurance industry has got to make clear their understanding and what they have to bring to the table in the insurance environment. And coalitions, of which there are plenty involved in Michigan alone, between the public sector and the private sector to bring about this mutual understanding are going to be critical. So we like to think of these things on the right side of the page as the facilitators to make what is already clearly an extremely promising technology actually get to where it needs to get. So I'll stop there, John, and just open it up for either questions now or later in the panel.
Yeah, we're gonna do. Thank you, Peter. That was excellent. We're gonna do questions at the end to make sure we get all the presentations in. But that's great. And so our next speaker is Kristen Kolodge. And Kristen is the Executive Director of Driver Interaction and Human Machine Interface at J.D. Power. So if MCity has a data garage, J.D. Power has what, a data football stadium? I think they are probably the premier data analytics and business intelligence firm, certainly for the auto industry and well beyond. So Kristen, you are up.
All right. Thank you, John. And hello, everyone. I really appreciate you guys joining us today and appreciate the compliments certainly on what JD Power does. So just a little bit of background about me and the company for those that might not be as familiar with what we do. So we focus on the voice of the consumer. So this is in multiple sectors, and the sector that I focus on in particular is in automotive. So I'm strategically looking at how consumers are interacting with their vehicles, what makes them happy, what makes them frustrated. So think in some cases voice recognition, navigation, those types of historical types of technologies. But as we move forward, we're starting to see a high level of satisfaction as well as a high level of frustration with several different ADAS technologies. And so part of what we'll be discussing today is certainly a bit steps forward of where we are from the ADAS technology. We're going to look at automated vehicles, so level 4, level 5 capability. And we'll also look at electric vehicles and where consumers stand on that technology, because right now consumers are seeing certainly a tie between, wouldn't it be great if an automated vehicle was also electric, right? So they're starting to piece those two types of technologies together as being very complementary to each other. But I'm going to talk to you today about some research that we've been doing on a quarterly basis in the United States over the course of the last year. So we've got a good amount of pulse, if you will, on what consumers are thinking regarding automated vehicle and an electric vehicle. So the short story at this point in time is that consumers are saying thanks, but no thanks, right? So we're not seeing a huge amount of movement, not seeing a huge amount of interest, certainly not matching the level of development, dollars, resources, production timing that we're seeing from the manufacturers. And so this is really important for us to have this conversation, see what can we do to be able to help influence these consumers so that when the products do come to market, they will be ready and waiting. So a little bit more about the technology, or pardon me, the research that we'll be discussing today. So again, I'll focus on battery electric vehicles that is strictly electric powered, no gasoline power, no hybrid technology incorporated, what consumers think about that, and then we'll talk about the self-driving technology. So this was general population that we researched in the United States. Again, the data that I'm going to show you is for the fourth quarter. So is for the fourth quarter of 2019. So we actually have our 2020 quarter one results coming out next week. So keep a lookout for that and seeing how things have changed. So just to begin, where are we with battery electric vehicle for consumer awareness, level of experience? As we think about these new different mobility models going forward, experience is going to be a very critical factor. The more that we can get someone to move beyond a perception of what this mobility model is going to be like to experiencing it in reality, the faster we're going to be able to shift this pendulum, and certainly, you know, put aside some of these perceptions that may not be reality, and certainly elevate some of these opportunities for surprise and delight. So at this point in time in the United States market, we have 2/3 of the population that have never been in a battery electric vehicle. So they don't necessarily know the type of acceleration, how quiet it is, how it operates, you know, how you're supposed to charge it, and the different opportunities there. We have a very small portion of the population that have owned an electric vehicle, and then you can see the other areas of experience in between. We go through a series of different questions looking at the pros, the cons, you know, how do you think this is going to influence your life? How do you think this is going to influence the environment? You know, we see very much consistency across each of the quarters that we've studied this topic, as well as, you know, for these two questions here in particular, where consumers are not challenging the, you know, what a battery electric vehicle can do for the environment. They see that as having a very positive effect on the environment. So in terms of that as a conversation starter, it's time that we can move on to another aspect of electric vehicles. When we ask consumers, how do you think an electric vehicle is going to affect your life? That's where we see less of a positive aspect, right? You know, people aren't necessarily drawing that direct connection on how it affects their life. And I think that's going to be one of the critical things as we're talking about, you know, how do we move this conversation forward, is really bringing it down into that personal lifestyle and how this can impact that person individually. So we ask a series of questions of what do you think the advantages and disadvantages are for battery electric vehicles. And I thought it was interesting if we compare and contrast those that have owned an electric vehicle versus those that have never been in an electric vehicle before, and just see where these perceptions stand in comparison to each other. So again, very universal on that element of it's better for the environment, certainly pretty universal regarding that cost to charge versus cost of gas. But I think we have some opportunities as you go lower on this list of where surprise and delight conversations could come in. So you can see performance and acceleration. Those that have owned an EV see that very much, you know, as a strong advantage. You know, the element that an electric vehicle is lower cost and certainly easier to maintain, that's another surprise and delight element. And I do think another conversation that isn't receiving enough attention is the charging capability at your place of residence, and realizing that not all people have the ability to charge in a garage or at their personal place of residence, but for the large majority that do, that really can be a very convenient item for them. Certainly something that elevates that electric vehicle experience, certainly in comparison to having to stop at a gas station to charge. We're seeing that type of conversation coming from consumers that once they've tried an electric vehicle, charged it at home, they never realized actually how convenient it was going to be. On the flip side, for battery electric vehicles, the disadvantages, we continue to see over time the same type of conversation, you know, charging station availability, driving range, purchase price. It's the same order, whether or not someone has owned an EV versus never been in one. Obviously the magnitude varies between, but the order is the same. And something to note, I was going back to some research that J.D. Power had done back in 1997 with the EV1. And at that point in time, it was the same top 3 barriers for consumers. So even though we're, 23 years later, we still have that charging station availability, driving range, and cost as the top 3 barriers. So we've certainly made tremendous improvements, progress in those areas. But again, these areas of consumer perceptions haven't necessarily moved the needle. But the point of note is, even for those that have owned an EV, those still remain their top areas of concern. So ultimately, this comes down to an element of what is the likelihood to purchase or lease an EV going forward. So again, comparing and contrasting those that have owned an EV versus those that have never been in one. So once someone has experienced an EV, we see certainly a significantly greater likelihood to purchase. I mean, it's almost equal and opposite to someone that has never been in one. So going back to that opening statement of really looking what we can do to move the needle to get someone to an experience in EV is going to be a critical aspect to helping to move this consideration for interest and likelihood to purchase, because we can see certainly very high numbers for those, for the 2/3 of the population that have never been in an EV, saying, their likelihood not to purchase one at all is quite significant. But the one element that we do see a level of agreement is in what consumers anticipate that the government tax credits or subsidies, how that factors into their decision. And so we see a high level of agreement that this is going to be a major factor, and very few people that are saying that it's not going to be a factor at all. So ultimately, as we've gone through each of these quarters of analysis for battery electric vehicle on our index rating system that we create across a multitude of attributes, we see that this number has not moved at all for the United States consumer. So even though we have a very large product proliferation, product offensive, if that's what you'd like to call it, coming here in the 2020, 2021 timeframe, we're not seeing that level of consumer interest shifting in accordance to that product proliferation. So certainly something for us to take note of as an industry and say, what else can we do to help shift this conversation? So in terms of shifting the conversation, I'm going to shift at this point and talk about self-driving vehicles. So again, just to set the context, this is going to be level 4 or level 5 type of self-driving capability. That's how we framed it to these consumers that we were researching. So looking at, just a starting ground point of what is the level of knowledge that consumers have about self-driving vehicles, we see a quarter of them don't, claim that they know nothing at all about them. So the level of, self-perceived knowledge regarding this, we have an opportunity to be able to help promote this type of conversation and certainly what this means to the consumers. With the self-driving vehicles, one of the elements that we focused on within this research itself was, going beyond self-driving vehicles in general and trying to apply it to various different mobility models. So whether you were riding in a self-driving vehicle, so whether that be an Uber or a Lyft, for instance, or your own personal vehicle, whether you were in a self-driving public transit, so like as Wei was talking about in the previous conversation, he was talking about the driverless shuttle that was deployed on the University of Michigan campus. That certainly could be an example of that. Or finally, goods being transported in a self-driving commercial vehicle. And so at this point, we still see the majority of consumers are shifted towards the right end of the spectrum, where they're saying they're not at all comfortable or not very comfortable. We see a slightly higher level of comfort with the aspect of goods being delivered, but again, very slight. But these types of figures have been extremely consistent over each of the 3 quarters that we've measured. So very high degree of repeatability about this consumer sentiment. Similar to the battery electric vehicle, we asked these consumers the advantages and disadvantages of self-driving vehicles. So we see, first and foremost, the benefit is the transportation for those that are unable or unwilling to drive. So this is, certainly great news that consumers are seeing this as an opportunity. By all means, that's one of the areas that we as an industry definitely agree with. I know that we as an industry are talking about fewer crashes, but at this point in time, the consumers, in their point of view, only about 1/3 of them are resonating with that type of benefit as well. But you can see some of the different quotes on the right-hand side that consumers, what they're thinking about. Of course, they're seeing where this might become a safer transportation solution, especially with those that are driving distracted, inebriated, different situations in that light where a self-driving vehicle actually might be safer. So you can see that type of conversation coming through. You also see, in the one quotation here where people are saying, fewer vehicles, families can share a vehicle. So looking at my ownership model. certainly is an opportunity going forward. The next is disadvantages, and we see top on the list is technology failures or errors, possibility of the vehicle being hacked, and legal liability or responsibility. And this is very, very consistent for the number of years that we've been studying this. So even though we've been doing this particular study for the last 3 quarters, we've been asking this type of question across various other JD Power research methods, but we're seeing this very, very consistently. But what it's coming down to is consumers are, very concerned about trust with the system. So trust in the technology, trust in certain mobility models to them personally. And so we have, for sure, some areas of we talk about with consumers. And so they're looking for, show me why this is going to be safer. I need, specific evidence of safety. And we're seeing that coming up more and more often now with respect to the consumers, not wanting to buy into the hype and looking for the actuality. The other element that I think is really interesting on this particular slide is, where we saw just about a third of the people that thought safety was going to be improved, we can see here even more people that think, pedestrian or cyclist safety or vehicle passenger safety, there's a higher percentage of people that think that this is going to be a disadvantage. So again, this is our opportunity to be able to help right size consumers on what we actually think is going to happen, and again, develop that proof for them. So in the similar vein as the battery electric vehicle, we have an index score. Again, 100 is the target that we're shooting for as an industry of what people want. So here we see another degree of consistency across each of these different quarters of this general population for the United States consumer on they feel their comfort level is with self-driving. So this is in a low category by all means, and certainly one that hasn't moved the needle yet. So for us to move that needle, we really need to start shifting that conversation back to that personal consumer. What's in it for them? How is that going to really shape their lifestyle, and start developing the proof points for them? So with that, I thank you for your time, and I look forward to your questions in a bit. And I'll turn it back to you, John. Thank you.
Thank you, Kristen, very much. And what a great compliment to Peter's presentation. So our next speaker is Hideki Hata, who is Executive Engineer at Toyota Motor North America. Hata-san would love to be seen as well as heard, but Toyota has a corporate policy that does not permit that. But that's okay. His presentation is very interesting, and I turn it over to Hata-san.
Thank you. So can you see my slide now?
We can.
Okay. Yeah, thank you for the introduction. I'm Hideki Hata from the Toyota Motor North America, and I'm located in Michigan, working on advanced safety issues at my technical strategy group. So as John mentioned, my laptop from work, we cannot use a camera. So, but I don't think you're missing that much. So you can just imagine the middle-aged Asian guy. So about the this consumer acceptance, that's a very important factor for OEMs, and how we address those things, and I can touch those things in my presentations. Particularly on the left side, this slide, it's one of the most important factors is the collaboration among people, vehicle, and traffic. So road, vehicle, and people, they need to work together. Often these three parties blame each other, but in a traffic congestion, you complain about it, but you're part of it. So if there's no parking and and we complain, but you're part of it. So we have to work together, and that's why the forum like the CCAT and also part of the University of Michigan AMTRI, MCT, and American Center for Mobility. So those are great places where the people who addresses these human issues and also vehicle issues and road issues together. Because our goal is ultimately the same as Peter and Kristen mentioned, that safety is our ultimate goal. So we want to achieve those things at a very good level. But we to separate speculation and reality, we need to work on the statistics. We have to base our discussion on facts. So this is the data is a little bit old, but this one is an illustration of what kind of accidents really happen in the United States. So x-axis is the number of crashes, and y-axis is the number of fatalities. So so you can see the type of accident, and I think that this matches to your understanding of the situation. There are so many rear-end crashes, and also run-off road type crashes. So run-off road, many of them are colliding into trees and stuff. They're very actually severe consequences. So that's why we as an industry need to address these important problems first. Then work on crossing paths. This is, I think, where the next generation of automated vehicle, connected vehicle can address. These are the intersection type crashes, which are very hard to work on with the current technologies. And lane change is the one, lane change and lane assist. So these also come into the world. So by looking at these facts and also working with many experts in the industry, so this is one example of how we push these solutions to customers. And it's the package of the active safety system, the automated emergency braking, and the auto headlight switching, and the lane departure alert, and adaptive cruise control, DRCC. Maybe this DRCC, the adaptive cruise control, is a very good example of the customer acceptance issue. Because the first car with automated ACC was sold in 1995. That was 25 years ago. Then now many cars are now equipped with ACC, but even us, we had a very hard time explaining what ACC is and benefit of those ACC. Then unless people experience it, once you drive it, you understand it. But it's very hard for us even internally to persuade the importance or effectiveness of these systems. So that's where the acceptance is not only to our end customers, but also internally. I think now we are at a good level of realization. Then in the further future, and actually now, automated emergency braking, that's something that worked for vehicle target and the pedestrian target, and we have expanded them to the nighttime low illumination level. So these are the ones that, in order for us to introduce these new features, we have to drive around everywhere. So it's really some dark areas in Japan, US, Europe, and many other parts of the world. And you can imagine the pedestrian collision avoidance. The pedestrian, there's no standard size or form. And if you go to maybe very northern area like Sweden or Finland, that people wearing those puffy clothes in the wintertime, and some in the southern area that people wear just t-shirt and short pants. So in Arabic countries, they wear those white clothes. So we had to work on way to gain confidence through the many field operational tests and data collection throughout the country to gain our acceptance, so we can be confident providing these solutions. And part of the new system include the lane centering assist. So these are the already standard on Toyota Safety Sense 2.0, but this is the area of the closer to the level 2 type automation. Then this is also the part that because it comes with it. It comes with any car, Toyota Lexus car you buy it now. So therefore, that they can experience the benefit of this one. So they see that maybe this is the path moving forward for the automation, we hope. Then these are the one graph that we had to submit our accomplishment toward the AEB agreement with NHTSA and IHS toward 2022. So we have already sold more than 7 million cars with this kind of systems in the United States. That we hope that we are contributing to improving the customers' acceptance on these issues. And I think this is the area, again, the early days of adaptive cruise control, we had to push some solutions. and to the customer so that they can really benefit, experience those benefits. Then we had to prove that our plan was really working. So we did a crash report analysis, and yes, we saw 17% reduction of the rear-end crashes with the cars we equip with this automated emergency braking. Then those are onboard sensors, but when we go to the future, the V2X communication systems, this acceptance becomes more challenging because the previous one, I think we can conclude our discussion only within Toyota. But now, once we come into the vehicle to vehicle and vehicle to infrastructure, we trust each other among different manufacturers, and also signals from traffic lights. We have to trust that one, so we can issue some kind of alert to our customers. So the level of acceptance need to start from the trust among OEMs and also infrastructure operators. So that's why we work with the state DOT, federal DOT, and also local agencies like Ann Arbor, and also University of Michigan and MCT. So to deploy this kind of the V2X systems in Ann Arbor, and we help deployment of the vehicle systems and also supported the road system. Roadside systems. So this is the one still in a research test bed for the future toward the product validation. But it's really that this is also kind of thing that we are proud that in Michigan we can lead this kind of activity so that the new innovations can happen from here. And this is Japan. We already deployed V2X product back in 2015, 16. So about 5 years ago. So then the day after they deploy those products in Japan, at the intersection, they measure the what's the effectiveness of providing the I2V type alert to cars, so they can avoid entering some danger near-miss situation. So we saw the 38% reduction of change of the driver behavior. We hope that this can result in their also acceptance. Also, future is something unknown. We have good hope for the future, but it's really not only by thinking, not only thinking by ourselves, but it's really the collaboration is a very important portion. That's why we have a safety collaboration center dedicated to working with universities or university researchers and make those findings public. So we can use those research findings as a foundation for the many other industry partners and those government and those people. So again, to conclude my presentation, again, we should always go back to the people, car, and road paradigm. These three pieces need to work together. So that's the end of my portion.
Thank you so much, Hideki. That is a great way for us to kind of end the formal presentations by positing the notion that the R&D activity that has heretofore dedicated to autonomous vehicles and now is I think transitioning and applicable to advanced driver assistance systems. I think that fact can be translated into both challenges and opportunities to address the kind of confidence gaps that Peter and Kristen highlighted in their presentations. I note we have a couple of questions. Calvin, do you want to handle this, or do you want me to open those up and see what they are?
I can read them off to you, and then you can kind of delegate who you want. A lot of these are at specific people. So we'll start with the first one. Question for Mr. Appel. How come more people from China, a low GDP per capita country, are ready for purchasing AVs, but at the same time are also more willing to give up ownership of vehicles for robo-taxis? How do you explain the results?
I would speculate that the survey question that says, are you more interested in buying one, is going to capture interest in having autonomous, where the the method by which they get it, you know, can be parsed further, but the first cut is there a level of interest in it? And that is clearly high across the board in China. So even, you know, once you split it down, you know, within the group that wants more autonomous, they'd be probably more likely to look for non-purchase ways of doing it. But the overall, the primary factor of is there a level of interest is so high that it brings up the levels across the board. That would be what I would, that's my understanding of how the survey ended up with those results, because of just the overall high level of interest.
Great. We have a question for Kristen. When you surveyed the consumers' comfort levels of AVs, did you distinguish those of those who have ridden in AVs versus those who have not?
For the survey, we did not. We do not have a baseline of who has ridden in an AV up until, you know, to this point in time. Right? I know that we've got some pockets of where this opportunity presents itself, but no, I don't have that experience, or we don't have that formulated within the survey at this point.
John, there's also a question. Might Tesla and Cadillac, owners that already have exposed to high levels of driver assist, be more comfortable going to L4?
So I think that's a good one for Peter. What do you think, Peter?
I think a good hypothesis is yes, that what we've seen is more awareness tends to lead to more acceptance. And so if you have the awareness based on actually experiencing some level of autonomous, based on, you know, the results we've seen, that would likely say that you're more likely to accept the next levels up. But we didn't survey that specific, you know, subset, but the other pieces of our research would cause us to think that.
And maybe Heideke, you might have an insight on this as well, because Toyota, of course, has experience with customers. As you introduce these more advanced safety features, you build trust in each additional application of technology. So does that kind of that logic obtain to the Tesla situation?
I hope so, but I think in general the level 2 to level 4 may be in complete different cars. So
Right.
I think that people who have used Tesla, Cadillac, I think they have good understanding of level 2 and on public roads. But I think therefore that they should have good expectation, more maybe accurate estimation about what L4 level 4 can be. But I think that as a person who is going to buy the next Tesla or Cadillac, I'm not sure their experience on Tesla Cadillac level 2 really significantly affect their decision of buying Tesla level 4 level or Cadillac level 4.
So
John, if I could just, I was just going to say, if I could just add in on that one. So, you know, we have started to see some consumers, when we look at their experience with vehicles on the road today and their experience with ADAS systems, where they're starting to draw parallels between their experience. And so I'll talk about lane keeping, lane departure, warning. You know, consumers' expectations is that those systems will perform very differently, and we'll be able to have an element of higher degree of capability, higher degree of consistency of performance, and they're not experiencing that. So if the vehicle's not maintaining its lane, can't handle a curve, we're seeing the consumers specifically saying, how is a vehicle going to drive itself?
Very good. Looks like we got another Q&A or Q.
Yes, this one is from Todd Bailey. It's a question for Toyota. With run-off-the-road crashes being so prevalent and lane-keeping technologies being increasingly prevalent, what can be done to improve edge-line pavement markings for machine vision technology, width, retroflectivity, presence, skip stripes across intersections, etc.?
Wow.
Yeah,
That's a mouthful. Okay.
I can expand on this. Is also a combination of actually the road, people, and vehicle. Then actually, when we investigate where those run-off road accidents occur, the roads are very good. Like that's straight and nice pavement marking and stuff. So somehow still people depart via off the road. So we have to think about how we can give them a lot, maybe last second is not enough, like 30 seconds before the please maintain the lane and stuff. So the improved pavement marking, that would definitely help because as you know, the camera is looking for the contrast between the black tarmac and also white line. But still, I think we should not give the wrong perception that on a particular rural road, the end of the white line to the end of pavement is less than 1 foot. Unless we have a perfect mapping and a perfect control, we cannot prevent these crashes. It's really physics issue.
Maybe time for one more.
Sure, we have one more quick question. Have you done any studies or research to what extent people understand the difference between the levels of automation?
Ooh, Kristen or Peter?
So for JD Power, not necessarily for the levels of automation, but we certainly have been looking at the type of terminology that's being utilized for the ADAS systems. And we see a very, very high degree of confusion there, as well as high degree of confusion on what they think that particular system is going to do.
Peter?
And in our case, our surveys are self-contained. We do not assume they know the different definitions, so we explain it in the course of each of the questions. So no, we haven't tested what they bring to the table and their understanding of the terminology.
Well, we're right at 3 o'clock. So I guess I want to take this opportunity to thank our panelists who did a wonderful job. I want to thank the folks that asked questions. I'd like to thank the folks at U of M CCAT for giving us the opportunity to be with all of you today.